Good afternoon, Cathy. How are you?
Good, Peter. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you and the Marcy Law movement for all that you've done and you continue to do for crime victims.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I have an election update. I know everyone's looking at politics these days, and my election update is that on election day, it was determined that we passed in another state. Marcy's Law passed in Kentucky with over 62% of the vote. So,
Oh, that's incredible news.
and I know you know what that's like because you were helped spearhead our efforts in Ohio, where we won, I think, 82% of the vote.
83. Yep.
83, yeah.
Yep, 83.
But who's
That
counting? Yeah,
percentage point in there. Yeah, we were thrilled. It was
yeah. You guys
absolutely,
ran up the score.
it was absolutely incredible. Yep. We're going to state by state, we're going to get there.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for all the great work you've done for Marcy's Law and the great work you do in the state of Ohio. And we're going to get into all that in a second. That you are the founder and the executive director of the Ohio Crime Victim Justice Center, which started as the Justice League of Ohio back in 2000. But yours is a story that the interview series that we do, as you know, is called Why We Do What We Do, because there's so many incredible stories, inspirational stories of people who now work in the victim rights movement like you, who sadly their story began as a victim. But on the more positive side of things, it was that became the impetus for people to turn their pain into some kind of a purpose like you have. And the stories are so inspirational, and yours is absolutely no exception. So I want to get into that. And yours is really a story that underscores the notion that victims are victims in the moment, and then sometimes they can be re-victimized by having to tackle the foreign world that is the criminal justice system. And sometimes they're turned away at every turn, and which is really why we start work in the victims rights movement, in order to take away the mystery and make what is an otherwise difficult situation as easy as it can possibly be. So I want to go back to your story and where it all began when you were a little girl in Lancaster, Ohio, and you were 5 years old and you had a stepfather. Tell us a little bit about how your story started.
Well, my stepfather, King Curly, as he was known by his motorcycle gang, was pure evil. He was a master manipulator, a destroyer of self-esteem, and violent. And my mother, unfortunately, wasn't any better. Thankfully, though, I had no siblings that lived with us. But my stepfather sexually abused me from the time I was 5 to 16 years old. In the beginning, he groomed me to believe that he was a person who loved me, the only person who loved me. I was his princess. He would protect me from my mother at times, and basically this is what all fathers and daughters did together. And I'd know this if my real father had loved me enough to stick around. There was kind of barely a day that went by that there wasn't some form of sexual abuse. He also abused another child during this time, which is kind of paramount to what we'll be talking about later. But it was a young boy that he brought in when I was around 9 years old. He wasn't much older than me, and we were forced to participate in things, all of us together. He had monthly parties with his motorcycle gang. During the parties, I had to play with the farm set under the pool table in the basement, and while the men were drinking and shooting pool, and I'd play with my farm set, watching the men walk around the table, and at some point during the evening, one would reach under the table and pull me out. But about the age of 12 years old, I really began to realize that this wasn't all what all fathers and daughters did together. And I began to question him, and I began to resist. And up until that time, I know it sounds weird when I say he wasn't violent, he was sexually assaulting me. But at that point in time, it turned to violence. The first day I questioned him, he grabbed me by the back of the hair, threw me to the floor, and had a knife to my throat. On occasions, he would sit me in a chair, put the barrel of a gun to my head, ask, is today the day, and then pull the trigger. When I resisted or cried, when I would cry, he would hold a pillow over my face until I blacked out. And then eventually, around 14 years old, enough is enough. And I honestly, I said, just do it, just pull the trigger. And then he threatened to tell my friends and to show them photographs. And oddly enough, I would have rather died than having him do that. So I learned how to fight the urge to resist. I learned to stop crying, and by staring into a light bulb on the ceiling and disassociating. So anyway, that's how
And this started when you were 5, and it went until the time you were 16. And you said he also took photos of you as well.
He did.
And you were aware of that, and you were aware that he kept those photos as well.
Oh yes.
And it was when you first questioned him, when you realized that this is not what is supposed to happen to little girls. That was when he became even more violent and threatened you with a knife, threatened you with a gun.
Right. That's when, honestly, what I can say, and I think, up until that time, I thought that he did care for me. I thought he loved me. I really had no clue. And it was kind of like that moment in time, that day, with him holding a knife to my throat. It's like being my entire world pulled out from underneath me, understanding at that moment in time, okay, wow, there's no one here that actually cares. And so, the next several years were pretty difficult until I was finally able to get out of the house.
And you were able to summon some kind of an inner strength to realize that it was time for you to go. When you left the house, and after you graduated from high school and you turned 18, you left the house and actually moved in with a friend.
I did actually. Actually, oddly enough, I know it sounds strange. I tried to basically run away on another occasion and was picked up by law enforcement. Now, one would think that I would have said something, but I didn't. I was too afraid and too humiliated. And so the day I turned 18 which was right in the middle of my senior year, I moved in with a friend.
Yeah. Well, actually, it doesn't sound strange at all in a situation like that. That anyone would want to run away, and so many times, as you and I both know from being in the system for so long, that that people would say, that people who aren't necessarily familiar with stories like that will say, well, why didn't you tell the police right away? And every case is different. And what we always say is there's no blueprint for how a sexual assault victim or a victim of crime is going to react. It's really unique to an individual.
Well, when they're master groomers and master manipulators, they do two things. Fear was a major part of it. What would happen to me if I did tell someone? But also, I have to say, the humiliation and shame that I was taught and how I was taught to think about myself was even greater than that.
Yeah, and you also described him as it's a textbook description. As a destroyer of self-esteem. He ripped your confidence away, and so it takes a while. And took a while for you to build yourself back up, but that you certainly did. So you moved away. You moved down to South Carolina for about a year, and then ultimately came back to Ohio and started your own career in producing commercials.
I did, yes.
And did you made a little money, you said, and traveled for a little bit?
Actually, yeah, it was wonderful. When I moved to South Carolina, the goal was just to put the past behind, never look back, and try to move on as if it never happened, and create a life for myself. So yeah, I was in commercial production. It was fun working out of Chicago and shooting commercials.
But then a few years later, you told me you had some credible information that your stepfather was actually physically and sexually assaulting another minor and a girl. And you didn't want to let that stand.
Right, I didn't. And I knew at that time that I had to put my fear and my humiliation behind, and I needed to report for her, to provide law enforcement that information, and also share what he had done to me. And I'd even reached out to the young boy who now was a young man, and told him about this other child. And although it was hard for him, he agreed to come forward as well.
And so you did do that, and you went to what you thought was the right place to go, and you were navigating this all by yourself, and you decided to go to the sheriff's department to make a report about not just the little girl that you knew about, but also the little girl that you once were, and what happened to you then.
I did. And when I went, I was within the statute of limitations for reporting my own crime, although I knew nothing about the statute of limitations. And I went with the intent to say, here's what I have to demonstrate that she's in danger. here's what he's done to me. Here's this other person. He did it to him too. We're witness to one another's. Please do something to help this child.
And you gave a statement.
Yes, I gave a statement.
And what was the sheriff's reaction?
So took me in, after taking my statement, took me into his office, set me down and told me a story about how rape wasn't always black and white, handed me my cassette marked evidence, and then proceeded to escort me to the door. And I asked him, I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, don't worry about it. We'll get back to you. Well, years after a long period of time, I realized, I kept calling back, what are you doing? And, after a while, you realize it's just like, wait a minute, I'm being totally blown off here. I decided then to report to the police department, at which point in time, the sheriff's office tried to say, well, when I went to the police department, they said, that's great. And you have a witness. We could move forward on this case. But 5 days ago, when you turned 24 years old, your statute of limitations had run, and there's nothing we can do. Well, I had reported months earlier to the sheriff's department, and then the sheriff's department tried to say that I never reported. Only problem, yeah, go ahead.
And when the sheriff's department, and you thought to yourself that the sheriff's department had a copy of the tape, but then you realized when he said, we'll get back to you, don't call us, we'll call you, in a sense, and he left you with that cassette tape. That was the only copy of it, and you still have that.
I didn't know that, and I did, and it's good to keep items. And yes, I still have this cassette today, which helped later. But anyway.
And so ultimately, this long journey of yours began really that day when you were trying to search for justice, not just for yourself, but for the other victims. And at some point, you realized that there were a lot more victims than just one or two.
Right. As after I reported to the police department, and actually they told me that was the correct jurisdiction. The sheriff's department wasn't even the correct jurisdiction, but at the time, again, I didn't know that. I also had reported to Children's Services. I was trying to think of some way to protect this child. And then I started thinking back to the photos that he had taken of me. And the fact that when I was 18, I had gone, before I moved to South Carolina, I wanted to retrieve the photographs and burn them because I didn't want him to humiliate me with them later. And at that time, his wife said, oh, we show them to our friends at parties. So I told police about that again. They chose to wire me, sent me back with a wire. And unfortunately, all I was able to get out of her was, at first she denied it, even having the pictures. We had a heated conversation. She eventually yelled and said, look, I told him to get rid of those pictures. I can't stand the fact that he has them. They're in a metal box behind the furnace. And I'm sitting there waiting, thinking, okay, law enforcement's coming around the corner any moment now. And they never came.
Because at that point, you were actually wearing a wire.
I was wearing a wire.
And you were hoping at that point that law enforcement, once they heard that the photos existed and exactly where they were in the house, that they were going to be coming with a search warrant.
That was the plan, yes.
And that never happened. And how was that explained to you?
It was explained that she didn't say nude photos.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It was explained, they said that's because she didn't say the nude photos, even though she said, I can't stand the fact that he's kept them. I told him to get rid of them. They're in a metal box behind the furnace in the basement. That wasn't sufficient. She didn't say, I told him to get rid of the nude photos of you.
So, but you still didn't stop there. And one of the things that you started to do, and in addition to calling victim services and law enforcement, you started to do your own legal research. You started to learn about criminal procedure and certain laws, specifically how the whole statute of limitations works.
I did. I reached out to every statewide victim service organization, members of the legislature, the governor's office, the attorney general's office, BCI&I, looking to anyone that I could that might be able to provide help, but nobody could. They explained the concept of home rule. They couldn't interfere in local county matters. There's nothing they could do. But many of them were so sympathetic and very helpful. And I liken this to sort of passing notes under the table. they'd say, okay, now go back to law enforcement and try this. I mean, wonderful law enforcement officers, great prosecutors, great judges stepped forward. One of the prosecutors in the Attorney General's office gave me access to LexisNexis. Another prosecutor that I met told me about an affidavit in support of arrest or prosecution to circumvent a prosecutor to initiate a criminal proceeding. Another told me about State versus Hensley, which gave me an avenue to pursue that would maybe indicated that the statute of limitations would begin at a little bit later date. All of those things. So, and during that time, as I was reaching out for help, so this is about 2 years into it from the time I first reported, when I'm trying to find some way to stop him. And I'm going back to the prosecutor, though, by the way, over and over again, you know, with all of these recommendations. And I felt like the mole in the whack-a-mole game. Every time I would take one of these officials, and him not knowing, these are recommendations that are coming from prosecutors and judges in other counties. He would whack, it would knock me down. Like I said, it's kind of like the mole in the whack-a-mole game.
And at that point, you were now pursuing justice for not just for yourself, but for multiple other victims that you at that point had credible information that he was abusing them as well. And at some point, a detective, I think his name was Detective Patton, you told me, reached out to you, and you learned that there were at least 2 others, in addition to the little girl, that were also being abused by your stepfather, your former stepfather.
Yep. Detective Patton first of all, he asked me why I had 5 identical police reports filed with the police department. And I said, well, because every time I request to talk to the prosecutor, he tells me to file another police report. But then one victim's family, a 6-year-old child that he had molested, family came forward with medical evidence a year before. So 1 year after I first reported, now we're 2 years into this. And then another family had come forward recently with medical evidence that their child had been sexually abused, naming my stepfather. And Detective Patton was frustrated because the prosecutor told him, well, that's just 2 children's word against his. If we had a 3rd victim, we would have a case. And so he asked if he could give the families my information, and the families and I connected.
So you were almost at that point a self-taught lawyer, and you then also instantly became a victim advocate. Yes. on behalf of those families. And so that was really kind of your first foray into victim advocacy. And you helped them navigate their way through the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. So at some point, he was indicted for all 3 of those cases. Is that right?
He was. Now, throughout his investigation, he discovered that there were at least 15 children that had been sexually abused from my stepfather from the time I first reported until he finished his investigation. And yes, and he was indicted for 3 of the families. The other families were afraid to come forward.
They were afraid to come forward. But the 3 that you helped to assist all did come forward. He was indicted on charges relative to all 3 of those. And the prosecutor at some point talked about a guilty plea.
Yeah, he had the day before the trial, he called the family in on a Sunday evening, and 2 of the family members had asked me to come with them. And so I was there with them. But when he indicted, there was 1 count of rape, 12 counts of gross sexual imposition. The prosecutor indicted incorrectly. He indicted the rape as it would be to a rape of an adult, which would be a lower sentence, versus the rape of a child under the age of 13, or raping a 6-year-old is life. The indictment was handled wrong. He was looking at serving total, potential 49 years, or at least max 25 years if it was concurrent max. But then he made a recommendation to ask for 3 years for the sexual assaults of these 3 children, and the families weren't happy. We had a law in the state at the time, which is an automatic sentence reduction, which meant he would have only served about 18 months. They weren't happy. Anyway, discussions about why would you offer such a low plea? What is the medical evidence? And, him arguing about, well, the medical evidence doesn't matter because it doesn't necessarily mean that he's the one that committed the crime. And that for one of the victims, he had refused to accept the charges of rape and the other counts of GSI on one of the victims in particular, and the prosecutor would not even entertain the concept of even moving forward on a plea on any of those. So we were dropped down to 5 GSIs remaining. He did move from the 3-year mark up to 8 years at least, and my stepfather happily agreed to the 8-year plea, which meant he ultimately served 5 years in prison.
But before that, the story took a very interesting and quite high profile twist, because after he was indicted, he fled.
Correct.
And you knew that he was going to flee because you saw that he was pawning some of his possessions, and you were trying to alert law enforcement that he was going to flee. And in fact, you were right, as you seem to have been throughout your search for justice. And after a while, people started to realize that you were right when you came forward with your information. So he fled, and this story ended up finding its way to John Walsh and America's Most Wanted television show.
It did. And when it was the neighbor, one of the families that lived 2 doors down, that he abused their children, they were watching him loading up his possessions, following him. And so anyway, yes, but the prosecutor still refused. Detective Patton asked to have him in custody prior to the grand jury hearing. Prosecutor said, no, he's a property bearing citizen. We see no reason to have him in custody. And so, yes, then he ran. So then was on the run for over a year. And I was working with Representative Lucas on legislation to extend the statute of limitations on sexual assaults. And she had said, why don't you call America's Most Wanted? And at first I thought, well, I think it's a little hokey. I don't know. But I did. And I cannot tell you, John Walsh is absolutely phenomenal. And yes, it ultimately led to his apprehension.
And it led to his apprehension. And in another twist, he actually turned himself in. The defendant actually turned himself in 2 days prior to America's Most Wanted, showing his story to the world. And his turning himself in didn't stop the show from being aired as he wanted to, though. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. That's what his attorney had told him. And that's what his attorney expected, is that the show wouldn't air because they didn't want that to air and more victims to come forward. So yeah, but no, it didn't work. John Walsh, went ahead and aired the show, said that he had turned himself in, provided a phone number for others to call at a sheriff's department if there were additional victims. Yep.
Now, and anyone who's familiar with the show realizes that the phone sometimes is a tip line to anyone who has any information where we could find this person. But he turned it creatively into anybody who has any other information about this person, any other potential victims. And he actually had you take care of some of the phone calls on the phone bank. Is that correct?
Well, what he had done is he incorporated me into the show. He talked about the 3.5-year struggle for justice, and how if things would have happened as they should have when I first reported, there may have been these other 15 other victims, and talked about that, how ultimately we were able to get him apprehended. And yeah, and then after that, a number of people began calling and asking to talk to me because they were in the same situation and they were looking for help, which was really disturbing, because I just thought all along, it's like, you get to short straw in life sometimes. I get short straw on parents, okay, short straw on detective and prosecutor in the beginning, but got a good one later, fantastic. I really didn't think that these types of things happen to so many people. And I thought that once I was done, he's put away, I'm done. I'm going back to Chicago. I'm going to start my career in commercial production again. And but actually it changed the course of my life. It's when I realized that we had a tremendous gap in the system, and that people needed a place to report and receive assistance when their rights were violated.
And you became a victim witness advocate instantly when you started to pursue justice for those victims. And then when you started to work that phone bank and you started to talk to all those people, you ended up becoming a victim witness advocate for a whole lot more people, including a little 9-year-old girl who was a rape victim that called you that day. And you still have a stack of papers from that day with the victims that you helped.
I keep these as a reminder of hard days but yes, this is a giant stack of, and I'm not going to put them too closely because they have names, but just I mean, there are 2 and 3 names on every one of those pieces of paper of people that needed help.
And so then you continued your pursuit for justice for your own case. And during that time, you tried to figure out how you were going to start some kind of an organization to help victims in a much larger way. You started it out of your house, and then it became the Justice League of Ohio. And tell us a little bit about how far that organization has come now.
Um, so initially it was a little bit difficult. Even though a lot of the law enforcement prosecutors, judges that helped me initially, helped in thinking through and the concept of how to build the organization, it was not well received initially. And there were no funding streams, but after a few years, I was able to hire my first attorney to provide free legal assistance to crime victims to help them. So from 2000 to now, we now have, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is to us, and it is for any other victims' rights legal clinic that in the country. We have 5 victims' rights attorneys, 5 advocates. We have an office in Cincinnati where we have 1 advocate and 1 attorney team, an office here in Columbus, and an office in Cleveland. And we help victims all over the state.
And you serve all 88 counties in Ohio.
We do.
And you then became affiliated at some point with the efforts of Marcy's Law when Marcy's Law was coming to Ohio. Yes. And as you know, when Marcy's Law comes into a state, we talk and partner with some of the great organizations that help victims, and it's so helpful when there are established organizations like yourself. And we started to talk to you in Ohio about how best to talk to victims and reach out to victims. And tell us about how you partnered with Marcy's Law.
Yeah, actually, I was thrilled. So not only myself, but several other of us in the victims community understood that Ohio had a very weak constitutional amendment. That and because of that, there was a difficult to really enforce victims' rights laws. So even though our attorneys were going in and representing victims at the trial level, and then we were trying to figure out, when their rights were still denied, how we're going to get it through the appellate process. We knew that we needed to change our constitution in the state. Although all of us had thought, how on earth are we going to do this? This is a heavy, heavy tow. None of us have the resources to really pull this off. And lo and behold, then Marcy's Law said, hey, how about we do this for you in your state? And that was amazing. So yes, we worked together for over a year, getting it, to get it on the ballot. Again, like you said, it passed by 83%, and it's been absolutely amazing. And since that time, since we had this passed, our cases have increased by over 450%. Justice system officials are more aware of victims' rights. The majority of them look to protect victims' rights and allow victims to exercise their rights. We provide victims' rights training to advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges. It's been incredible. And now we have so many cases right now pending in the appellate court, which is phenomenal. And the referrals that we're getting, so it used to be that primarily advocates would refer cases to us. Now law enforcement are referring cases to us. A lot of prosecutors are referring cases to us. And judges, there are judges even beginning to refer cases to us.
And you talked about how since Marcy's Law's passage in Ohio, the raw data that you talk about is the fact that your cases and your referrals have quadrupled since Marcy's Law's passage. But you attribute it to the fact that Marcy's Law, after Marcy's Law having been passed in Ohio, creating meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights for victims, it has really kind of created a culture statewide that has empowered victims to come forward to an organization like yours.
Mm-hmm. It has. It's empowered crime victims. It has empowered advocates, and absolutely, it's and again, it's really informed the criminal justice community, and yeah,
and just we're wrapping up now, but one of the you've told me so many great stories about how you have incorporated Marcy's Law into your victims' rights toolkit. That is an incredible, if people want to go on your website and look at it, it's an incredible resource for victims and for victim advocates as far as case management tools go. And you spell out all of the different victims' rights and the different phases of each process. It's really an incredible resource tool. And you've updated with all of the constitutional rights affiliated with Marcy's Law. And you shared with me a note that some sent to you, that somebody, a victim that you guys have helped, a rape victim. And I just wanted to, obviously no names attached, I just wanted to read this while we wrap up. This is to you from a victim that you helped. Hi, I just want a message of gratitude to you and your team. I testified today against my rapist, and because of Marcy's Law, I have the right to stay in the court for the duration of the trial. The defending attorney was flabbergasted that the judge allowed me my constitutional right to be present. Thank you for everything that you and your team does. It gives me a little hope that there are people and an organization that cares for the rights of the victims as much as they do for the accused. God bless. And that really sums up what you have done, what Marcy's Law has done, and how powerful the connection is and the collaboration is between your organization and Marcy's Law. So I wanted to thank you, and your hard work is such a testament to every single person, every single victim that can look to you and realize that you did it all by yourself as a little girl who turned herself into basically a self-trained lawyer, a victim witness advocate, a CEO, a founder of an organization. And you shared with me a quote that keeps you going. And I'd like you to share it, a proverb. When you're faced with hard work and you don't know how you're going to go forward. And if you could just end it with that quote.
If there is no wind, row.
Yeah, and that's clearly what you've done. Your story is fascinating. It's amazing, and it's inspirational. And thanks for sharing with it. It's very personal. Thanks for sharing it with all of us today.
Thank you. And may I just add one more thing? I also want to give a major shout out and appreciation to my team. As you know, as a nonprofit, it's a lot of hard work, and we are just so blessed to have an incredible team of attorneys and advocates that are helping victims every day. And they're amazing. And
they have a good leader. Thanks, Cathy. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you.